On a frozen morning along the northern edge of the Ardennes, the world seemed to hold its breath. The fog clung low over Elsenborn Ridge, muting every sound, except the distant groan of armored engines pushing west. To the American infantry, dug into the hard winter earth, that silence felt like a question, one that asked who would still be standing when the day ended. They didn't know it yet, but the ridge beneath their boots was the last solid anchor on the northern flank of the Allied line. If it fell, the road to Liège and Antwerp would open like a wound. And the men advancing toward them, SS panzer troops, hardened by years of war, believed momentum and surprise were on their side. But buried deep inside the American fire direction tents was something the Germans could neither see nor imagine. A small wooden tool, barely the length of a soldier's hand, that would turn every grid square on the map into a place of sudden, devastating danger. How did a simple piece of wood and plastic become the invisible edge that broke the German assault before it ever reached the crest of Elsenborn Ridge? That story begins in the cold, just before the gun spoke. The opening moves began long before the fog settled over the ridge. Hitler's final gamble, what the world would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, was built on a single, daring premise. If German armor could punch through the Ardennes, seize the high ground at Elsenborn Ridge, and rip open the northern flank, the road to Liège and Antwerp would lie exposed. The goal was not merely a tactical victory. It was a strategic upheaval meant to fracture the Allied line and buy Germany time it no longer had. To achieve this, more than 200,000 German troops and 1,000 armored vehicles surged westward, driving toward a front defended at first by men who were never meant to face such an assault. The 99th Infantry Division, newly arrived and spread thin across a 22-mile sector, had been assigned to what senior commanders believed was a quiet portion of the line. Rugged forest, poor roads, winter weather. American planners thought these would make large-scale attacks impossible. They were wrong. At 05:30 on December 16th, the horizon erupted. German heavy artillery, Nebelwerfer rocket barrages, and mobile guns thundered across a 50-mile front. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes, shaking the frozen earth and shredding tree lines. Soldiers later recalled that the sky itself seemed to split. Yet, the casualties were fewer than expected. The foxholes the Americans had carved into the hard soil, deep, reinforced, and built with care, saved lives even as the psychological shock rippled through every unit on the line. When the shelling paused, the real test began. Waves of German infantry pressed forward. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division, supported by the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, advancing toward the Losheim Gap and the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath. These green American troops were supposed to crumble under the weight of such a blow. Instead, they held. Young lieutenants and NCOs made calm, instinctive decisions. Machine gun crews shifted fields of fire with precision. Small squads clung stubbornly to stone farmhouses and forest edges. In places, the fighting bordered on the impossible, nowhere more so than at Lanzerath Ridge, where an 18-man reconnaissance platoon delayed an entire German parachute regiment for nearly 12 hours. That single stand threw off the timetable of Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, and bought the Americans hours they desperately needed. But even courage has limits. By December 17th, the pressure was beginning to crush the line. Units were bending. Gaps were forming. The 99th Division's positions were at risk of collapse. It was then that Major General Walter M. Robertson of the 2nd Infantry Division made a decision that would shape the coming battle. The twin villages would be used as a delaying shield, a place to conduct a fighting withdrawal that allowed both divisions to regroup on better ground. That ground was Elsenborn Ridge, high, defensible, and already home to an expanding network of American artillery positions. It would become the anchor point for the most concentrated use of firepower in the European theater. And as the battered troops fell back toward the ridge, the stage was set for a new kind of battle. One where timing, not just fire, would decide the outcome. By the time the retreating infantry reached Elsenborn Ridge, the character of the battle had begun to change. The brutal street fighting in Krinkelt and Rocherath had bought just enough time for the ridge's defenders to prepare a line that was deeper, more connected, and most importantly, covered by an artillery network unlike anything the Germans had faced in the West. At the center of that network stood Brigadier General John H. Heinz. Every gun under his control, 348 pieces from the 1st, 2nd, 9th and 99th Divisions, reinforced by heavy corps artillery, had been surveyed, registered, and tied into a web of telephones and radios. Forward observers from multiple divisions were patched directly into his command post. Any movement on the approaches to the ridge could be reported and engaged in minutes. But the true edge was not the number of guns. It was the speed at which they could act. Traditional artillery doctrine demanded sequence. One battery fired. Observers adjusted. Another battery followed. The process, rooted in World War I, worked, but it was slow. By the time the second battery fired, German infantry had already dispersed. Their doctrine taught them to scatter within 15 seconds of the first incoming rounds. Against the sequential fire, that instinct saved lives. Against what the Americans were preparing, it meant nothing. Inside the cramped fire direction tents, the tabular firing tables that had slowed calculations for decades sat unused. In their place was a deceptively simple wooden instrument, the graphical firing table, born from Captain Abbott Harrington Burns's frustration with 76 pages of numerical data. It looked like a carpenter's tool, barely 10 inches long. Yet in trained hands, it transformed the impossible into the routine. Calculations that once took 5 minutes now took 20 seconds. Elevation, drift correction, fuse settings, charges. Everything could be aligned, read, and transmitted before a German platoon could finish crossing an open field. And because every battery now worked from the same rhythm, something new became possible. Time on target. That demanded precision. Guns at different distances had different flight times. Batteries closer to the target fired later. Those farther away fired earlier. All rounds had to arrive within a 3-second window. Before the graphical firing table, coordinating this across multiple battalions was mathematically unrealistic in combat. On Elsenborn Ridge, it became standard practice. December 19th proved the concept. 3 German attacks massed against the 99th Division's positions were shattered before they fully deployed. One mission dropped 5,760 shells in 20 minutes. Prisoners later said they never heard the first rounds. Everything arrived at once. And as the Germans reassembled for another push, Heinz prepared to wield his artillery not as a supporting arm, but as the decisive weapon of the battlefield. The ridge was no longer just ground. It was a fuse line, ready to ignite the moment the Germans stepped it into the open. By December 21st, the Germans were no longer testing the American line. They were throwing their strength against it. The 12th SS Panzer Division, still convinced that the ridge could be taken with enough force, advanced once again toward the southern approaches near Dombuchenbach. The terrain was open in places, a gentle slope leading upward toward the American positions. To German planners, it looked like the last opportunity to break through before Allied air power returned with the improving weather. But what they walked into had already been measured, registered, and prepared. Forward observers from the 26th Infantry Regiment watched the German formations form up, their silhouettes moving through the mist. When the first panzers pushed forward, the observers transmitted the coordinates with calm precision. On the ridge above, fire direction centers in multiple divisions began calculating simultaneously, graphical firing tables sliding under clear cursors, hairlines snapping into place over exact values. 30 seconds later, the ridge answered. Shells detonated across the German assembly area in a single, crushing instant. High explosive rounds tore through the infantry. Air-burst fuses shattered 3 limbs and sent shards seething across open ground. White phosphorus blossomed in burning clouds. Tanks staggered, their optics shattered by near misses. One American officer described the scene simply. They dissolved. German doctrine, scatter after the first rounds, was useless. There were no first rounds. Only the simultaneous arrival of dozens of batteries firing as one. The division tried again that afternoon, believing the morning barrage must have been an anomaly. Instead, they met the same impossible precision. Every attack faltered before reaching American lines. By nightfall, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, once among the most fanatical and aggressive units on the Western Front, was bleeding out in the snow. The psychological toll was immediate and severe. Veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front, who had endured Soviet massed artillery, said that the American fire at Elsenborn felt different, faster, sharper, impossible to anticipate. Every movement seemed observed. Every shelter felt temporary. Officers reported that their men no longer believed they could close with the enemy. Their confidence, the intangible but essential currency of offensive warfare, was collapsing. And with their morale, the German timetable collapsed as well. The 6th SS Panzer Army had been tasked with achieving the breakthrough in the north. But without control of Elsenborn Ridge, they could not access the road network required to drive toward the Meuse River. The ridge became a wall, a silent, immovable boundary that no amount of armor or aggression could overcome. By December 23rd, the German offensive in the northern sector was effectively broken. The failure to seize the ridge forced Hitler to shift efforts southward, fracturing the coherence of the entire Bulge campaign. The offensive, once envisioned as a swift, decisive blow, devolved into a costly struggle, fought along too many axes with insufficient fuel, coordination, or hope. The cost of those lost days would follow Germany to the end of the war. To the American commanders on the ridge, The success of their artillery was not an accident. It was the culmination of a doctrine built on flexibility, speed, and trust in decentralized decision-making. Unlike their German counterparts, who relied on rigid pre-planned fire maps and sequential barrages, American fire direction centers treated artillery as a shared resource. A forward observer from the 99th Infantry Division could request fire from the 1st, 2nd, or even corps-level guns without navigating layers of hierarchy. What mattered was the target, not the patch on the observer's shoulder. This philosophy, sometimes called general support artillery, gave American units a responsiveness unmatched on either front. A single threat could draw fire from dozens of batteries. A developing breakthrough could be crushed before it matured. Mobility reinforced this advantage. Who says batteries displaced, reoccupied, and were ready to fire far faster than German units, still moving equipment by horse or struggling through bottlenecked roads. Other armies took note. Soviet artillery, unmatched in sheer volume, lacked the agility that shaped Elsenborn. Once a Soviet fire plan was set, it was difficult to redirect. Their strength was mass, not precision. British artillery, though highly professional, rarely matched the American tempo in coordinating multiple battalions under sudden battlefield conditions. For Germany, the disparity was devastating. Captured officers studied American positions and equipment, puzzled by the speed with which fire missions were executed. Radios were standard. Plotting boards were familiar. Nothing seemed extraordinary until scholars decades later discovered that the Germans never understood the significance of the graphical firing table. To them, American speed looked like a mystery. To the Americans, it was simply the result of clear doctrine and a 10-inch tool that removed minutes from every calculation. The strategic implications were profound. Elsenborn Ridge demonstrated that firepower alone was not the deciding factor. Coordination was. Speed of calculation dictated speed of response, and speed of response created tactical dominance. The lesson resonated across military institutions worldwide in the years after the war. Control the tempo, and you control the battlefield. In the United States, that principle became a cornerstone of post-war doctrine. From early digital fire control to GPS-guided munitions, every innovation traced its lineage back to the insight proven in the snow of the Ardennes, that a few seconds saved in a fire direction tent could shape the outcome of an entire campaign. When the snow finally settled over Elsenborn Ridge, no banners flew, no grand speeches marked the moment. There was only the steady silence that follows a battle survived, but not forgotten. To the men who had fought there, the ridge was not a symbol. It was a memory, etched in cold wind, frozen earth, and the unmistakable thunder of American artillery, arriving exactly when it was needed. History would later shine its spotlight elsewhere. Bastogne, with its encircled paratroopers and famous reply of nuts, captured the imagination of generations. Elsenborn Ridge, by contrast, offered no easy meat. It was a battle of calculations in canvas tents, of forward observers hunched over radios, of gun crews working by feel through numb hands and sleepless nights. It was a victory rooted not in spectacle but in precision. And that is precisely why it mattered more. By holding the northern shoulder, American forces denied the Germans the road network they needed for any chance of operational success. They preserved the integrity of the Allied front. They bought the time necessary for counterattacks to form. And they proved, conclusively, that in modern war, the ability to coordinate firepower is as decisive as the firepower itself. At the center of this achievement stood three men, each largely forgotten: John H. Heinz, whose command fused hundreds of guns into a single instrument; George Kaiser, who understood the value of an idea others dismissed; and Abbot Harrington Burns, who carved a simple wooden slide rule late one November evening because he disliked slow math. Their work did not earn headlines. It earned victories. The graphical firing table, humble and unadorned, became the unseen fulcrum on which the ridge, and perhaps the entire northern flank, was balanced. Time on target, once a theoretical notion, became the hammer that shattered elite German formations before they could even raise their weapons. Today the device sits quietly in museums, a relic without shine. Yet its legacy echoes through every modern artillery system, every digital fire direction center, every munition guided by calculations completed in the blink of an eye. The principle remains unchanged: speed saves lives. And so the Ridge endures, not as a myth, but as a lesson. That wars are often decided not by the loudest heroics, but by the smallest innovations. That courage can take the form of patience, discipline, and cold precision. And that sometimes the future turns on the width of a wooden ruler. If this chapter of history moved you, share your thoughts below. Which lessons from Elsenborn Ridge still matter today? We read every comment. And if you value these forgotten stories, stay with us for the next one, because history is still being written.